Hello, everyone, and thank you for checking out my YouTube channel, The Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. We are joined by somebody that you are familiar with at this point. Dr. Lincoln, as always, it is a pleasure to have you on, sir.
Thanks, Nick. Hopefully this is a good kind of third episode, right? It's the Return of the Jedi rather than Revenge of the Sith. We'll keep our fingers crossed.
Ladies and gentlemen, he has actually published some really great work on academia that I'm going to include in the links below. He has also put out a book that I will also provide a link to that I also own, which is absolutely phenomenal. If you don't own it, you need to get it and need to read it because it's great.
It's relatively easy to think of history as a straight line, right? We're used to thinking about individual sources as presenting our points of data, and it's the job of the historian to take all those little facty bits and find some line of best fit, right? Here's the place where things go a little bit odd. Here's a place where they fit perfect to form. But of course, that's never actually the case, right? History isn't the study of events, it's the study of people. According to the great French medievalist Marc Bloch, who of course famously died while fighting the Nazis, history is the science of man, of course with a capital H in French, across time. It behooves us then to think about what that can mean when we're not always sure about the individual pieces and parts of the events in question. I wanted to take, for our third episode today, the sort of major source that gives us so much of the information about the figures in the first two, Alfonso the Emperor and Alfonso VIII of Castile, and talk about this character who seems to have written, or perhaps rewritten, most of their history to fit what he understood as the predominant themes in the world around him and the world that preceded him. The author in question is a Navarrese nobleman educated in Paris and Bologna who eventually rises to the very highest political position one could find in medieval Iberia, the post of Archbishop of Toledo. Hailed as the primate of the Spains, primas Hispaniarum, the leading ecclesiastical figure, a kind of deputy pope in everything but name, the Archbishop of Toledo was perhaps the most influential, if not necessarily the most powerful, of religious figures in the peninsula. It's worth thinking about where an archbishop comes from, though, before we get to his historical work. Rodrigo Ximénez de Rada seems to have been born, as I said, to a Navarrese nobleman, Ximénez de Rada. His father was active on both sides of the Castilian and Navarrese border, although eventually he comes to favor the Castilian side for reasons his son would find quite fortunate. And it seems also that Rodrigo was not the oldest of his family, despite eventually being the most successful. When he's a very young man, he's educated at the monastery run by one of his kinsmen, a man named Martín de Finojosa, who runs the Abbey of Saint Mary of Huerta. Now, if you're thinking, Nick, about taking a countryside trip through most of northern and northeastern Castile up towards Catalonia, a nice long drive from Madrid, say, to Barcelona, Huerta could be a nice stopover, but it's the kind of stopover that your wife might say, okay, maybe only about an hour. It's not much of a town anymore. It's a town perhaps of 1,000 people or less. And the monastery itself is really the great attraction. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a stunning example of Cistercian architecture in the 12th and 13th century. And most of the monastery is still in pretty good shape. Although occasionally when the river floods, there are some challenges. So in the retaining walls, that's all that really one needs to speak of when it comes to the challenges of the space. Like any good Cistercian monastery, it starts out in a place that's difficult, right? It's Santa Maria de Huerta, or Huerta in Spanish is a garden, and it's a garden that takes a lot of work. It takes so much work that by the time Rodrigo has finished what we would recognize as sort of elementary school, which of course all has to be done in Latin, and we could do a whole other series of videos on education in the medieval world because it ain't easy. There are some moments where Rodrigo seems to have figured out, actually, I'm pretty smart. My dad's well-connected. My uncle's well-connected. If I'm going to school in Paris, eventually he'll take a little side trip to Italy as well to do a little law. Maybe I should make out a will, right? It's dangerous to go to school. It's dangerous even in modern universities to go to school, right? There are all kinds of vaccination campaigns, safety awareness campaigns. Even modern universities are not easy. But if we imagine walking from Navarre to Paris, coming from one linguistic background to another, coming from one educational background in a Cistercian monastery to this burgeoning university in Paris, this is not a small undertaking. So Rodrigo makes a will. Like any good medieval cleric, he makes a will that is designed particularly to ensure that if he dies before he's expecting to, he'll at the very least have a decent chance of getting into heaven quicker rather than slower, right? Purgatory is going to happen, but if we can shorten that period of time, that'd be great. Rodrigo makes a rather precocious will, though. He does say that he wants to be buried at Huerta, That's the place where he took his Cistercian vows. That's the place he wants to be buried. It's got strong family connections to his kinsmen, and so it's not all that unsurprising. He wants to be buried near family, both biological and spiritual. But he adds an interesting clause. He says that he wants to be buried at Huerta, etiam fuerim episcopum, even if I should become a bishop. That's pretty ambitious for a young man. Even if I should become a bishop, I want to be buried at my own home monastery. It's also rather prescient, given the fact that he'll not only become a bishop, but of course an archbishop later on. We don't know a ton about the period between 1200, when he makes that will, and 1208, when he finally comes back to Iberia and is eventually elected to be the new Bishop of Osma. Now, Osma is another one of these towns that if you were to take a roadside vacation, it would be perfectly wonderful. They have this sort of thick-cut bacon fatback breakfast thing, these big hunks of wonderful salted pork that you can have for breakfast, and that'd be a good use of your time. You should see the cathedral and then move on. Burgo de Osma is not an important city in the 12th century, except for the fact that it has these deep roots to an older tradition. It seems to have been a town that at some point had probably had Visigothic settlement. Of course, they only sort of appeal to that in this kind of vague sense of propagandistic precedent. But Osma is still nevertheless important. It's a city that recently has had a couple of really good bishops. And although in the middle of the last century they had actually had a bishop deposed because he had actually bought the position of bishop, a crime called simony, things have sort of settled down. In fact, the last couple bishops have had a pretty Cistercian bent, or at the very least a Benedictine one. Martin Bazan, his predecessor's predecessor, had been an old black habit Cluniac monk affiliated with San Millán de la Cajoya. His predecessor, Diego de Acebes, had taken the Cistercian habit on his way back from Rome in a diplomatic mission, in which he brought his young sub-prior, the future St. Dominic, on all of these adventures. So Rodrigo's got a pretty good first job, all things considered. But he never actually takes over as Bishop of Osma. He's bishop-elect for about a year and a half, and it turns out that the death of a really successful Archbishop of Toledo, who leads, as we mentioned in our last video, this enormous cavalry raid, is one of these big political figures, really successful. He dies, and it seems like Rodrigo is the next hot hand, right? He's this young prospect. He's incredibly young for the position, and he gets elected and elevated to the position of Archbishop of Toledo. He is, par excellence, this kind of pioneering figure for Toledo. He's not the most important archbishop they've ever had. That distinction probably belongs to the person who took the job in the first place when Toledo had been annexed, if we want to borrow that term, in the late 11th century. But Rodrigo is by far one of the more successful they're going to have for quite some time. He very early on, of course, as we mentioned in our last video, figures out that the young Prince of Castile, Fernando, is itching for a crusade, and together they organize the Crusade of Las Navas. Rodrigo plays a huge role in that campaign, providing stipends to all of the foreign soldiers, and of course, pivotally inspiring Alfonso VIII's countercharge, the so-called Hic Moriamur frescoes at both Huerta and in Las Huelgas in Burgos. Both attest to the fact that Rodrigo plays this enormous role in this moment. Of course, when Alfonso VIII eventually dies, and of course, Eleanor, his wife, dies only a few weeks recently to him, there's a big power vacuum, right? The oldest daughter of the pair, Berenguela of Castile, not only has children of her own, 2 sons and a couple of daughters, but we also have the young prince, Enrique. The first prince, Fernando, had died in the run-up to the campaign of Las Navas, as we talked about in our last video, but so too is now there's this very young king, Enrique I, named after his grandfather, Henry II of England. And Enrique and Berenguela seem to have the monarchy side down. Rodrigo is going to give them as much political and economic cover, leading the bishops of the kingdom, who, of course, have this really strong relationship with Alfonso VIII, and so now with his children, too. Unfortunately, Enrique seems to have been playing in a plaza one day when he gets bonked on the head with a roof tile and dies. A rather tragic circumstance that pushes Berenguela and her son Fernando into the center of the Castilian political drama. That story has all been told beautifully by both Gianna Bianchini and Miriam Shaddis, and for those who can read Spanish, of course, as well, by Salvador Martinez. So we've got plenty about Berenguela and her son Fernando, and if we wanted to, Fernando could take up 16 videos. He's one of those characters. But what's Rodrigo up to? Rodrigo very early on seems to have figured out that the Archbishopric of Toledo is a strange and special place. He's patronizing a number of big translations. In particular, as Carlos Ayala has noted, his translation efforts seem to also have focused on figuring out ways to explain what the Almohads are up to and explain why they're wrong, but why their ideas might actually explain why Christians are right. It's a pretty classic propaganda move, right? Turning someone else's positives into your positives and showing why they're in fact negatives. He sponsors a young deacon of Toledo, and he has his own his own dean of the cathedral, Mauricio, who is soon to be Bishop of Burgos, as these kind of patrons of a number of arts projects. Mark of Toledo will not only do an enormous and very careful translation of the entire Quran. It's a translation that Thomas Berman has studied very carefully, and which shows actually a pretty close reading of the text, albeit with some innovations and inventions, but not all that far from course for contemporary Christian intellectual thought. He'll also ask Mark to translate this sort of collection of theological writings that define the Almohads as theologically different compared to other millenarian movements in the Maghreb in that period. He'll have them translate all of their sort of important intellectual documents. We'll come back to why this is important in a minute, because it starts to be at this moment that Rodrigo recognizes that Berenguela and her son Fernando are on the rise. He supports them quite vigorously and will actually lead a number of campaigns to help add more pieces to the whole program of campaigning and conquest that really defines Fernando's early reign. Once he starts to get on his own feet, he captures Leon from his half-sisters after his father's death, and really starts to become the preeminent monarch in the peninsula, rivaled only perhaps by his cousin James of Aragon, who is, of course, about to start his own enormously successful program of conquest. Eventually, he'll take over Valencia and the Balearic Islands, and will write his own autobiography, as really successful kings sometimes do. During the same sort of transitional period, however, Rodrigo's got a really big religious project that he has to take care of. He's been summoned, as all the bishops and archbishops and most of the abbots of Christendom, to this massive council led by perhaps the most important pope of the late Middle Ages, Innocent III. He summoned them to the Fourth Lateran Council in part because there are a lot of things that they all need to take care of, right? This is, of course, famously the council where they finally figure out how to explain transubstantiation by creating a new word. They're also going to settle a number of important political disputes. See, Rodrigo is Archbishop of Toledo, and that means his title, among others, is Primate of the whole of Spain, right? Primas Hispaniarum. But not everybody agrees on that. The archbishops of Tarragona will say, well, sure, but not really, we don't care. Santiago and Braga will say, well, that's great, but we were too, so nah, right? And this jurisdictional claim actually becomes something of a political firestorm, because each of those major archiepiscopal centers are in different kingdoms, right? And so often these kinds of political machinations can stand in as a sort of proxy war of words between the kingdoms themselves. Rodrigo shows up ready to debate the primacy of Toledo, as it's often referred to. It gets its own day at the council, which must have been a pretty big moment. And he comes out with a speech that is so full of rhetorical fireworks that one wonders if most of the prelates were able to follow it, as though he's really kind of showing off, yeah, Paris, Bologna, and Toledo, what do you got? Unfortunately, he's not successful. He doesn't convince the Pope, and there's real problems. And so he'll spend most of the rest of his life trying to relitigate this issue through a number of proxy conflicts. He and the other bishops come back, some of whom have borrowed enormous amounts of money. And it turns out that one of his suffragans, the Bishop of Segovia, goes a little bit crazy. We don't know exactly what he's up to. It seems that the Bishop of Segovia tries to bring some of the decrees from Fourth Lateran back and either gets them wrong or explains them so poorly that his own churches within the diocese actually are in open revolt. They all claim that the Bishop of Segovia has gone mad. Please, Archbishop, can you take over for us? Because this is enough of a problem now that we need someone to step in. Rodrigo does, and he sits as governor of Segovia for quite some time. And eventually, he's so successful at holding on to the diocese itself that his successor, after the mad bishop either retires or dies, he just sort of disappears from the record. His successor will go on as elect and not able to hold the see, probably because Fernando needs the money, and probably because Rodrigo also would like some of the money, please. the diocese goes unfilled, right? So this is a classic example of Rodrigo's political acumen, but also his strategic thinking in terms of finding a place where he can get a little bit of the money back that they have laid out in the enormous expenses for Las Navas, and which, of course, they're only getting small payments back on, because Las Navas, although it is widely celebrated as the thing that sort of breaks Almohad power in the south, didn't exactly get all of Andalusia to instantly become Christian and start paying taxes to Castile. Right? It's instead, it's fractured things, and it makes it easier for a unified Castile to take over. But the conquest of Andalusia is by no means written in stone by this point. Rodrigo actually will help in the late 1220s into the 1230s, lead a number of campaigns. He'll actually send his own chaplain to take over one of the conquests that he leads himself, and he'll take a number of cities in the hinterland between Jaén and Baeza and Cordoba, right? And those are sort of Fernando III's signal projects. But it's at this point that Rodrigo, either in looking for legacy building or because his own political projects in ensuring that Sevilla and Cordoba, if and when they should be restored by papal fiat, will eventually come under his umbrella, right? So he's feeling relatively confident by the late 1230s that he starts to do something that is not all that uncommon for medieval religious clerics in any sort of formal sense, right? You know, lay clerics are writing all the time, but actual regular diocesan officials don't always take the time to sit down and channel their inner Otto of Freising or Matthew Paris and write out a longhand chronicle.
I do actually have a question related. So basically, the Fourth Lateran Council happens, and then this bishop comes back and apparently just screws up the transmission of letting people know what happened at the council. Do we have any examples of what he just completely misrepresented?
Yeah, so the problem is that we don't have his version of things, right? What we have instead are echoes. It seems that what he is trying to limit, and of course, a lot of this is speculative. Garcia, the sort of great Spanish canon legal historian and great historian of the Fourth Lateran Council, seems to suggest that there's a problem with administrative rules, and that instead of being able to sort of run the administrative parts of one church while having your own vicarage, right, your own parish, right, so that if enough people are sort of sharing those duties, they can all get like an income and a half. And so long as they're not doing the pastoral care for each diocesan parish, they should be okay, right? They shouldn't be illegal. There's part of the suggestion that that's what's up. The later legation of John of Abbeville, this sort of Parisian master turned cardinal in the 1220s and early 1230s, seems to suggest that that might be part of it. But there's also some things that sort of the local yokel clergy might be getting in trouble for. There's some suggestion in the back and forth that, for example, Jews and Muslims in the Kingdom of Castile and Leon are not being required to wear the badges of infamy that they're supposed to have in Lateran. Right? So this tradition of Jews and Muslims wearing distinctive dress so that they stand out from Christians is something that has a long medieval precedent, but Fourth Lateran says, like, no, really, for everybody, this is a thing. And we'll also place other restrictions, which are not uncommon for Jews and Muslims in Christian territories, as of course they wouldn't be for Christians and Jews in Muslim territories, right? This is a sort of a similar scenario, right, of protected second-class citizenship status for Jews, and of course Muslims and Christians will do this very differently for the other within their midst. There's also a possibility, given earlier precedent and given the complaints that John of Abbeville comes back with, that there may be a problem of clerical concubinage, which is to say of priests having mistresses that live with them. Of course, a lot of the clerics at the time will say, no, that's my housekeeper. No, that's my cook. And, then that's all fine and good if that's true. And the Cardinal d'Abbeville thinks that it's really not. Earlier on, actually, Osma in 1199, Martin Bazan, Rodrigo's predecessor, had actually had to secure two papal decrees on questions like this. One of which says, hey, you can no longer have people be half canons. They can't be a portionary canon, a status which I'm in the present actually investigating what exactly that means, because how you can be a half priest or a half deacon is a little bit peculiar. How can you be a half canon or a partial cathedral canon, what exactly that means is a little weird and sticky and nebulous. So I'm figuring that part out. But the other thing he gets on the very same day is actually a thing that says, no, cathedral canons are absolutely not allowed to have concubines, that's really not okay. And of course, Innocent, in writing to Martin Bazin, says, like, as you know, yes, we affirm, in fact, this is the way it is. And that pronouncement is so crystal clear that it works its way into later canon legal collections as like the definitive way of explaining why it's not okay. So there is some possibility that there's clerical concubinage, perhaps relationships with religious minorities. Segovia's got a particularly wealthy and well-established Jewry, so there's a possibility that that's it. But it could also be administrative functions, like being partial canons or partial priests of some of these dioceses, and perhaps even some people being in charge of multiple parishes at the same time. So all of those are possibilities. Garcia favored the kind of pluralism answer. Linehan has famously favored the idea that it's in fact religious minorities and concubines. I think that generally, if you can get Garcia and Linehan to agree on something, that you're probably right. Garcia was quite famously never wrong about anything, not by self-aggrandizement, but he was just that good. And Linehan has made a career out of 600-page books like History and Historians of Medieval Spain that still to this day people find a footnote and that's their dissertation, right? Like he's one of the massive figures. And so it's entirely possible that it's concubines, it could be administrative questions, it could be relationships with religious minorities, all of which could be reasonable explanations for exactly why Gerardo of Segovia is supposedly crazy. Of course, all of those could be also convenient fictions that we just have no reason to, or no way of proving the opposite, right? It's almost, but the echoes suggest at the very least that those are reasonable explanations and probably right. But as usual, right, the medieval world, we're 800 years removed from the controversy in question. So, okay, so it's in this aftermath of Cordoba and Sevilla, before the Council of Lyon, where Rodrigo will have his sort of last conciliar visit, that he really starts to take an interest in chronicle writing. I've got one of them here with me. It's one of the Corpus Christianorum series of his great masterwork, which is usually titled the Historia de Rebus Hispaniae, the history of the things of Spain. Its secondary title is Historia Gothicorum, a history of the Gothic peoples. He means here like the Gothic peoples in the sense of the sort of mythical propagandistic version that everybody's a Visigoth, from Portugal all the way to Aragon and Catalonia, of course, with the exception of the Carolingian and Basque peoples in the northeast of the peninsula. So he's sort of got this sort of grand vision of history. He starts writing, but this isn't his only work. Rodrigo also will famously write a history of the Arabs, where he writes a history of Islam up to about the middle of the 12th century. Some scholars have claimed that some of the information is accurate enough in the Historia Arabum that we can suspect that Rodrigo can read Arabic pretty well. Probably not well enough to like get into the nitty-gritty of philosophy, but enough to where he can kind of thumb through the stuff, and if he needs help with a translation, go get some help on it. There's enough material in his chronicles that actually suggests he's a pretty capable historian. But here's the problem. There are two guys that come right before he starts writing. Lucas of Tuy, a bishop on the other side of the border in what is now sort of very most southern parts of Galicia. And of course, his contemporary, Juan of Osma, is probably the author of the anonymous Chronicle of the Latin Chronicle of the Kings of Castile, a sort of shorter chronicle that really sort of lays out the contemporary history of Castilian events from about the middle of the 12th century onward is really where its new material comes from. Both of these are themselves really important sources, and I don't want to downplay them by focusing on Rodrigo, except to say that what Rodrigo does is take all of their new information, take other earlier chronicles like the Historia Silense, the Chronicle of Alfonso the Emperor, Isidore of Seville, a lot of these earlier sources, compile them and rewrite them all, right? And in sort of traditional medieval fashion, sometimes he copies, sometimes he parrots, sometimes he adds his own spin outright. But there are a number of instances actually where Rodrigo will go back through and sort of airbrush up some of the details. It's of course from Rodrigo that we get the portrait of Sancho the Third of Castile showing up to the treaty at Sahagún with his brother Fernando II, and Sancho is this resplendent image of kingship, and Fernando smells like the farm. That's nowhere else. It's only in Rodrigo's version that we get this sort of portrait. So too do we get the portrait of Alfonso VIII founding cities and being a wonderful leader. And he's taken over Cuenca and he started Plasencia, and don't worry about that Alarco stuff. And then he retakes all the lands from Navarre, and he does all of these wonderful things. And isn't he great? And it's an entire book of his chronicle, right? And it's, of course, important to remember that when we're talking about books, right, we're talking about an enormous division of his work. One of the books of his chronicle is all about Las Navas de Tolosa. It's an enormously close write-up of what happens on campaign from an eyewitness and one of the principal architects of the campaign itself. Martín Elvira has recently discovered what may be the proto-version of this part of his text, what gets included in a liturgical memory of the event for celebrations in Burgos. But it seems that Rodrigo himself is writing this text down from memory. And of course, it's in one of these sort of typical medieval fashions that this is where we get the most important treatment of Rodrigo's life. He will put himself at the heart of Alfonso's countercharge at Las Navas de Tolosa. It'll be he who tells us that, in fact, Alfonso was a little bit worried, and he said, well, we got to go. And Alfonso will reply to Rodrigo, but we will die here. And Rodrigo, ever the archbishop, ever the pastoralist, says, if we're going to die, then at least we'll be crowned with a crown of martyrdom. And so let's do this. And there's this kind of empowering moment where Rodrigo comes out, of course, as the hero, right? And it's worth thinking about what that does for this chronicle as a whole. It's one of the best accounts of Las Navas that we have. It's perhaps paired with our now Emeric's letter to the Cistercian General Chapter about the campaign, the best eyewitness to what's going on. Of course, Rodrigo is right there for all of this, and he will continue to write up to his death. That really sort of sets out all of Fernando's accomplishments as the kind of like part two of Alfonso's, right? So if we've got the Luke Skywalker version for episodes 4 through 6, this story of Rey and Ben as this kind of second tier retelling of the same sort of dark and light really comes out in Rodrigo's, right? Except in this case, it's not dark and light, but rather Leon and Castile.
Right.
Almost every chance, Rodrigo will actually undercut Fernando II. He appears very irregularly and will make out Alfonso IX as this kind of villainous character. It's Alfonso who is allied with the Almohads and will invade Toledo in the time of his predecessor, Martín López de Pisuerga. It's Alfonso IX who is this sort of meddling ne'er-do-well. And Berenguela, yeah, she married her first cousin once removed, but it was for the benefit of the peace, and she was really good about it. But Alfonso IX was a little bit not great. He won't actually come out and condemn him, of course, because his king, Fernando III, that's his dad, so that's a little bit politically dicey. But he'll do airbrushing as he can to make Berenguela look strong and make Fernando look strong and make Alfonso VIII look strong and make Leonor look strong. He'll actually refer to Leonor Plantagenet, the sort of great medieval figure for queenship in medieval Iberia. Leonor will actually be described as prudentissima, as most prudent, as most clever, which, you know, if we're going to come up with an adjective that's typical of the Plantagenets, clever is probably about right. Certainly prudent is spot on. We don't know a ton about Rodrigo's composition process, but it does seem that he's really carefully taking all of the information in other chronicles and distilling them and layering them so that he's got this sort of master write-up of everything that's going on. So much so that by the time Fernando's son, Alfonso X, takes over and starts to do his own sort of vernacular history writing project, famously the Primera Crónica General, as Menéndez Pidal called it, but of course we've recently understood that it's a much more messy process. This Historia Hispana, as the project at the University of Birmingham in the UK has shown, is actually this really nuanced and layered thing. But what we do know for certain from Menéndez Pidal on down to the current editions is that Rodrigo is all over the Historia de España. He's all over the Alphonsine histories. In fact, rather than citing an authority by name, they will actually frequently in the Alphonsine history say, this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and this thing happened, according to the archbishop, según el arzobispo. They don't name which archbishop that is, but it's clear every time that it's Rodrigo's account. It's always Rodrigo who's the best source. He kind of takes on this role as the sort of preeminent historian of his era. And so it's worth thinking about what that does for some of our chronicles. We've already talked about, of course, his retouching of the treaty at Sahagún, and he'll do similar things when it comes to other events. It's in Rodrigo's account that he perhaps preserves some echo of an earlier epic tradition that praised Sancho II of Castile and his killing as the sort of moment where the whole Rodrigo El Cid process starts, that whole epic cycle that sort of throws the Cid into this rebellion conflict with Alfonso VI, of course, legendarily and quite erroneously categorized in the Cantar de Cid as this kind of good vassal, bad noble. And we should see some of the fingerprints of Rodrigo's age on that text, as well as this kind of Castilianization of this earlier Leonese history. But it's worth thinking about what Rodrigo does in this period and how he rewrites a lot of the stories to favor, yes, the Toledan cause, to favor the Castilian cause. Castilian history takes up an enormous part of Rodrigo's original composition. Much more of it is about Castile than Leon, despite the fact that there are more bishops in Leon, more of the political wealth and aristocratic heritage is in Leon. And it's in Leon where really Rodrigo could do the most work of filling in some gaps that his predecessors had written about, but that he could do more reworking. Instead, he sort of leaves out the parts he dislikes and moves on. His portrait of Alarcos, Nick, is barely a paragraph. And granted, it's a Latin paragraph, so it's probably 3 paragraphs in English, but it's barely a paragraph of a defeat that, according to contemporary chroniclers, in Arabic has Alfonso VIII shave his head and never visit his wife again, right? They have other children, and as we discussed in the previous episode, we know that that's a sort of handy political story. But Rodrigo nevertheless skips over Alarcos very quickly and does so with a direct political purpose. As a historian and an author, he's got this enormous footprint on the medieval Iberian world. And so I think it's worth thinking about who is this person behind this story. Lucy Pick has famously seen him as this kind of careful negotiator of rough tolerance and collaboration to try and keep both the Mozarab population within his city, the Jewish population within the city, and even the Muslim merchants who are coming to and from Toledo, kind of, at the very least, balanced against one another, if not necessarily in some kind of happy harmony, right, to try and keep things at least calm and settled. And it's worth thinking about why Rodrigo is so careful about adding new dioceses and new conquests, right? He's constantly mortgaging his diocesan properties in order to finance Fernando's campaigns. And it's worth thinking about why in the famous Repartimiento de Sevilla, this sort of division of all the territory around Sevilla, why 2 bishops, the Bishop of Segovia and the Archbishops of Toledo, come out as by far the biggest ecclesiastical beneficiaries outside the newly formed Diocese of Sevilla. And so it's worth thinking about, too, how Rodrigo shapes a lot of our history of the age. We wouldn't be able to write, in a lot of ways, a good history of Alfonso VIII's reign without Rodrigo. And we wouldn't be able to write a very good history of the early reign of Fernando without Rodrigo's chronicle either, even though he's not a perfect voice, right? Our primary sources lie to us all the time. And so we really have to know what they're lying about, what they're concealing, what they're airbrushing, to figure out what they're concerned about. And so I think it's worth taking a little bit of time to think about these kind of sources as a kind of coda to these earlier biographical depictions of Alfonso VII and Alfonso VIII that we've done already, and also as a way to sort of look forward to other future videos, thinking about the ways in which Rodrigo's version of telling the stories of these heroic figures, whether it be describing Ibn Mardanish, the wolf king of Murcia, as a noble and prudent man, although Muslim, right? He's able to label those figures in such a way because he is trying to think about, okay, I need to be credible, but it would also be great if I could get a little bit of my own edge involved. And it's worth thinking about, too, in this larger historical lens, how our sources shape our stories, right? We know that later Iberian kings will often refer back to their heritage, and it's in part this sort of Castilianization of the Iberian heritage that really plays an enormous role even today, where this larger debate about whether Catalonia should separate and whether Castile, that is to say the heart of sort of western half of Spain, should be separate or together with this larger community, right? That's not uncommon in Rodrigo's world. He's seeing those same kinds of challenges. And so thinking about how our sources can color our versions of history is really worth taking some time, at the sort of pivot point between one set of ideas and one set of videos and the next, so that we're at the very least clear about the fact that, when we talk about guys like Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, El Cid, how is it that our early 13th century source and our mid 12th century source come to pivot across one another in sources like Rodrigo's? And how do those telling of stories and retelling of stories shape the way we understand them collectively?